Hello, this is Andrew with Missing Remote, and this is a TRENDnet Ethernet over coax adapter 2-pack. While it's not in the name, this is actually a set of MoCA adapters. For those who don't know what MoCA is, it is a way to turn this into this through your house using existing coaxial cable wires. These should also play nice with an existing setup. Some cable providers use MoCA to push internet access between the different set-top boxes. And so I don't have that set up here at my house, but that is one way that you could use these as well. Inside the box, obviously we have two of these TMO-311C adapters. They each have a RJ45 gigabit Ethernet port, and then two coax jacks. One is an input, the other is an output for television. The most common use case for these would be to put internet access behind an existing television, or to push internet access from a room where your internet router is into another room, but over the coaxial cable that's in your house or your apartment. Now, obviously, Cat 5e or Cat 6 cable is going to be faster than this, but that's not always an option. And sometimes wireless is not fast enough for what you might need to do with it, or not stable enough. For example, we used to live in a house that had cinder block internal walls, and I couldn't get decent wireless speed throughout the house. So for things that required a lot of bandwidth, I ended up using MoCA for that. So everything's in place. Let's talk about these MoCA adapters. So I'm not going to run through all the features specifically. Y'all can read. Basically, you're going to use coax cable with the two adapters to make a network connection using MoCA protocol in your house. And then the performance, they claim, is somewhere between 400 and 800 megabits bonded. And the things that are, I guess, important to note is that it's not compatible with DirecTV Dish Network or AT&T Uverse or other non-MoCA compliant subscription services. So, duh. Although I guess I probably shouldn't say duh. I should just say providers that have existing MoCA configurations in your house, it should be compatible with them. But that's not these guys. So let's talk about security. By default, the adapters come configured to not use security keys to encrypt the traffic between the two adapters. I asked TRENDnet about this, and they said that the reason why they do that is around plug-and-play usability. And I kind of get that explanation, but I also think that it's the wrong choice on their part. Now, of course, security is always about levels of convenience, where no security is the ultimate in convenience, right? You just plug stuff in and it just kind of works. Unfortunately, because it's easy for you to use it, it's also really easy for somebody else who you might not want on your network to use it too. And when you use these adapters in like a standalone house that's far away from all the other houses, that's probably okay. It's probably not going to be a problem because MoCA only really goes a certain distance down the coax from your residence. While that is a use case for this, I think a very common use case for MoCA adapters is in multi-unit housing, like apartment buildings or condos, an environment where there's lots of people living compactly together. And in that environment, unencrypted MoCA adapters are exactly the opposite of what you want. Unless you know where your coax terminates in your unit, and you can put a MoCA filter there. But one, you got to buy a MoCA filter. Two, you got to know that you need to do that. And I think that if you know both of those things, you're comfortable doing both of those things, you're probably the kind of user that isn't going to benefit from the plug and play aspect, or benefit that much from the plug and play aspect of the adapters either. So I think that it's the wrong choice. I think the right choice on TRENDnet's part is to default to a more secure setup. Now, obviously, there will be a cost and convenience because you'll have to do something to make them work, maybe. So one option for them to make this work easily would just be to burn security keys in the pack. So as part of the configuration, before they stick it in the box and mail, and seal everything up, they just have an app that burns the keys into the configuration on the device. The second option is that when you install this at your house, they have a little configuration utility that you can just download, and you double click it and you run through the wizard or whatever, and it just works, right, to set up the security keys that are unique to your environment. Either one of those is, reasonably convenient and ultimately much more secure than what we have. Now, what we have isn't terrible, but you do need to know that you need to do something, which is to walk through this PDF that explains how to set up the security keys. And we're going to go ahead and do that right now. First thing I'm going to do is just to make sure that everything's turned on. And then you're going to want to go to your network adapter configuration settings and go to the properties of it, and then go to the IPv4, and then follow the directions here where it says to enter in 192.168.144.1, tab in, and then accept the subnet mask. You don't have to change anything else. Okay. And then you're going to want to go load the adapter 192.168.144.200. So I'm going to go and refresh this. Now, you didn't see it here because I already authenticated, but the default username and password, admin. So, of course, one of the first things you're going to want to do is change that when you set this up. So if you wanted to, you could go in and change the IP address to use DHCP or something different on here. But this is the default configuration. And while it's inconvenient, it does add a little bit of, I hesitate to use the word security, but let's just run with that. Because if it was set to DHCP, then somebody else that was on your network that you don't want to be on your network using could configure your MoCA adapters for you if you didn't know how to do all of this. So we're going to go ahead, we go to the security settings here, and as the instructions indicate, you're going to turn on DXT, D low, D high. And you're going to want to make sure that whatever you put in for the passwords for these, that you can replicate that on the other side, because we're going to go do that as soon as we do it on the one. We have to just flip the LAN cable over to the other one, jump in, authenticate, and enter the same security key. So we're going to click check. We're just going to change this to 1. Save. And as the instructions indicate, we want to reboot the thing. So while it's rebooting, I'm going to go just flip the LAN cable here from one to the other so that I can configure them to use the same security key. So here we go. We see our admin. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. Security settings, flip. And again, changing this to 1. Save. And reboot. So it will take a couple minutes for the devices to reboot and everything. And then once you verified on the devices that the MoCA lights between the two of them are green, you're going to want to go back and change your network settings for the IPv4 network back to the way that it was, whatever it was. And then you can see that we're all good here. On the performance side, this is where things are really interesting for me, because this is way different from the last time that I played with MoCA adapters. So I'm going to show real quick, we have a whole bunch of different performance setups here, where first let's start with the Wi-Fi configuration, because I think that that's probably what most people are going to use, or what most people are going to see as an alternative to a MoCA installation. And you can see here that the ping, the latency, is pretty good. I mean, I have a pretty good Wi-Fi environment here. So this is just my Wi-Fi, which might be different than your Wi-Fi. But here's the baseline for me to compare these. So average is 2 milliseconds, which is really good. but the bandwidth is only about 254 megabits per second running iPerf, which is of course a synthetic benchmark, but it's the tool that we have. Comparing that to our unencrypted MoCA, so latency is 3 milliseconds, so a little bit higher, but that you're not going to notice that really in use. But the bandwidth is a lot higher. Looking at when we turn encryption on, we see that there's no latency penalty, but there is a slight bandwidth penalty. We went from 900 megabits, 907 megabits per second to 868 megabits per second. Now here, I don't know that this is something that you would really feel when you're using it. For example, doing an SMB copy here. This is with encrypted MoCA. It's running at 113 megabits per second, which is effectively the same as I see when I use 1 gigabit Ethernet connection. So using the MoCA versus, the best case for wired Ethernet, you don't really feel any difference at all. For completeness, I do have the same stats here to compare what we would see with a gigabit Ethernet connection. We can see here the latency is pretty awesome at 0 milliseconds, and our bandwidth throughput is 941 megabits per second. So higher than both the unencrypted and encrypted MoCA, but not so much higher that you're really going to feel much of a difference there. And then just because I can, I'm also going to show you what it looks like with a fiber connection. This is a 10 gigabit fiber, and again, we're not going to see any improvement in latency. It's still 0 milliseconds, but there's a huge delta between all of these things and fiber. So if you want the best, get fiber, but that's a lot more than most people are going to put in. So summing all of that up, slight latency penalty, but nothing you're probably going to feel. Massive bandwidth improvement over wireless connection. Where things aren't so brilliant is in the stability. So I'm hoping that this is something that TRENDnet can address in a future firmware update. But what we see here is pretty consistent with my own experience of using these on a day-to-day basis, is that most of the time it works great. Some of the times it doesn't work great. And we can see here where I was just happened to be running an iPerf when things didn't work great anymore. You can see the network connection, fine, not fine, recovers a little bit, then not fine, then it blips and goes away. Most of the time, you just kind of, when you're using it, you just kind of, something happens and it just feels weird. The connection always recovers itself. I'm imagining that the MoCA adapters renegotiate the connection between the two of them. But that process can take a while. And in some cases, it's completely noticeable. If you're watching a YouTube video or streaming some content, it's long enough that you might be able to see a blip, or it drops it, or as you can see here, the iPerf connection just died. Now it always comes back up again, but that's something that it shouldn't happen. It should just be solid, 100%, never happen. So hopefully that's something that they can address. But it is something that I do need to point out, and I don't see that with any of the other connection types that I'm using. So again, hopefully that's just something that they can address with a future firmware revision. And finally, I want to say thank you to TRENDnet. They did supply the MoCA adapters that were used in this review, so it would not have been possible if they hadn't done that. So thank you, TRENDnet. Now, hopefully you all found this useful. If you did, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below, and I will get to them as soon as I can. Thanks.